Good evening. How are you doing? Good? Well, I'm happy that you could be here. And we're going to have translation once again tonight for our Spanish crowd. Did you have a good day? Yeah. I had a good day. I had a very good day. Before we begin tonight, I'm going to begin with a word of prayer. We're actually going to start with a little bit of review, and then we're going to delve deeper into some new information that we have not touched on. So, like I said, the first few minutes will be a review, and then we'll press forward. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to study science and Scripture, the two books you've given to us, Nature and Revelation. I pray that you would teach us, that you would guide us. In Jesus' name, amen. As we talked about already, we talked about that there is a gut-brain connection. We've talked about this nerve that connects the brain to the gut. It connects to other things like the lungs also, but this nerve called the vagus nerve that connects the gut to the brain. We talked about how 90% of the information that's traveling in that nerve is from the gut to the brain and not the other way around, meaning only about 10% of the information goes from the brain to the gut and 90% from the gut to the brain. And scientists have discovered that a high-fat diet leads to depressive, anxious symptoms in mice, and it also promotes inflammation. So what was the study like? So basically, they put mice on a high-fat diet. This is like a 60% fat diet. And what ended up happening, as they were on this, it began to promote inflammation. The high-fat diet began to promote inflammation. It began to promote problems with their memory and repetitive behaviors. And then they put another group on a standard fat diet that was not a high-fat diet, and they did not exhibit the same negative characteristics. Well, what ended up happening was they took the microbes, the bacteria, out of the gut of the high-fat group, and they put it into the guts of the regular fat diet group, and then the regular fat diet group began to experience anxiety, impaired memory, repetitive behaviors, and inflammation. And they in the study kind of correlate this with things like depression. Depression, typically you have these negative or OCD kind of repetitive negative thoughts. They were doing these repetitive behaviors. They were exhibiting characteristics of anxiety. It negatively impacted their memory and inflammation. And once again, as we've already talked about, inflammation often, most lifestyle diseases are impacted by inflammation, but depression also is often an inflammatory disease. So potentially, if you can lower the inflammation, you might be able to lower the amount of depression. And kind of an interesting quotation here that says, "It cannot be too often repeated that whatever is taken in the stomach affects not only the body, but ultimately the mind as well. It is difficult and often well-nigh impossible for one who is intemperate in diet to exercise patience and self-control." We see that with these mice, but this actual concept, I obviously am a Christian, and this concept actually comes from the Bible. 2 Peter chapter 1, 5, and 6 says, "Add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience." So before we have patience, we're to have temperance. And it's interesting that when we're intemperate in diet, it can actually negatively impact our self-control. We also saw the passage from Jeremiah that the Bible talks about this gut-brain connection. My bowels, I am pained at my very heart." They saw an emotional connection between what was going on in the gut and what was taking place in the brain. Now, I want to do a small overview of a little bit of the physiology of digestion. Not any of the great intricacies, but just a small overview. We talked about it last night that one of the ways to help the bacteria, the microbiome in our gut, is to have fiber. And fiber is only found in the plant kingdom because fiber is part of the structure of plants themselves. And so as we eat that, we are feeding the bacteria the food that they need, and then we said that they end up giving us what's called a postbiotic or a byproduct called short-chain fatty acids, which lower levels of inflammation in the body. And so we need to feed the bacteria so that they can in turn, if we make them happy, they can make us happy. They can make us happy. And Scientific American has an article that says, think twice, how the gut's second brain influences mood and well-being. Now, we talked about this. They're now calling the gut the second brain. And notice what it says in the article itself. It says, the second brain informs our state of mind in other more obscure ways as well. A big part of our emotions are probably influenced by the nerves in our gut, Mayer says. Butterflies in the stomach. Signaling in the gut as part of our physiological stress response, Gershon says, is but one example. Although gastrointestinal or gut turmoil, GI turmoil, notice the words here, can sour one's moods. So gut turmoil can sour one's moods. Everyday emotional well-being may rely on the messages from the brain below to the brain above. And looking at this is quite fascinating. Notice this here. It says people who have a sour stomach are very often of a sour disposition. That's what we just saw from the researchers speaking there and or this article rather in Scientific American. Everything seems to be contrary to them, and they are inclined to be peevish and irritable. If we would have peace among ourselves, we should give more thought than we do to having a peaceful stomach. And one of the important parts to think about is that in our gut, we mentioned this with babies. We talked about how babies receive their immune system in part as they're going through the birth canal. They're given the bacteria from their mothers. And 2/3, actually upwards of maybe 70% actually, of our immune system is found in your gut. And so that idea that we talked about yesterday, that it was old Hippocrates that said all disease begins in the gut. Well, not all disease, I wouldn't say, but many diseases may actually begin in the gut. Many of them. And so we want to have a healthy immune function, and in order to do that, we have to consider what we're eating and our environment in life. We talked about some studies similar to this next one, but they all seem to be leading in the same direction. This is the surprising link between gut germs and toddlers' tantrums. What is this talking about? What they discovered is that toddlers that were more antisocial, unhappy, and had more tantrums had less diversity of gut bacteria. And toddlers that were more social, more happy, and more outgoing had greater diversity of gut bacteria. So now my wife and I, if we ever see like a little 3-year-old who's really social, like, hi, I'm Joe, we're like, wow, that kid must have great gut bacteria. Now, we don't know, but it sure seems like it, at least according to the research. And so if you wanted a good ratio of good gut bacteria, what should you do? And one of the things that the researchers point out is they point out that people who move toward a more of a plant-based diet, where the majority of their food is coming from plants, actually have better intestinal bacteria. We already mentioned why. This makes sense from what we looked at last night, that each plant has a microbial diversity. You know, bananas will have their own, apples will have their own, peaches, pears, plums, kale, cauliflower, you got it. They all have their own bacterial diversity. And so eating a diversity of them will help to colonize your gut, your microbiota or your microbiome with the good bacteria that you need for your health, for your the actual taking care of both your immune function and the health of your brain. And once again, this fits with the biblical worldview. If you think about what the Bible said back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, it says, "And God said, Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food." So this was back in the Garden of what? What is it called? The Garden of Eden, right? And the word Eden in the Hebrew language, in the original language of the Old Testament, the word Eden means pleasure. Pleasure. So it's the garden of pleasure. So you would just assume, if you were a Christian, or maybe a Jew for that matter, that you would assume whatever God gave Adam and Eve in the garden of pleasure was best designed for their pleasure and happiness. And fascinatingly enough, the closer people get to that diet, and in a healthy way, they become happier. This right here is from the Bulgarian Journal of Plant Physiology. I'm guessing you don't read that on a regular basis, but the actual study, or the title of this review is Animal Neurotransmitter Substances in Plants. What does this mean? What this means is that scientists are discovering that the brain chemicals that are called neurotransmitters are actually found in plants. So as we seek to do what? As we actually eat these foods, we may be giving ourselves some of the chemicals that our brains need. And so if we're not getting whole plant foods, if we're getting refined, like for instance, you're not going to find the benefits in refined sugar. Well, sure, sugar came from a plant, but once you refine it, you're taking away the good bacteria, you're taking away the neurotransmitters that would be there. And so it would make sense, as we've already looked at, we saw that people who drank water were significantly happier, and people who drank soda or pop were more prone to have mental health problems, right? This isn't being judgmental, it's just looking at the research. And so this makes sense as we get toward the whole food, meaning eating the apple is better than the apple juice, and eating the beet is better than eating sugar, because most sugar today does not actually come from sugar cane, it actually comes from beets. And so looking at this, the point is getting it in the whole form gives you all the micronutrients, the phytochemicals, the vitamins and minerals that are there, and the good bacteria, and the fiber that you can't digest but the bacteria can. You put that all together, and it's like the Creator knew what He was doing. He knew what He was doing. He put the whole package there. And so we can find that benefit. So we've seen, yesterday we looked at babies with colic. We saw that they didn't have as good of a diversity of bacteria. We've just seen that toddlers exhibited the same experience. We talked about how bulimia, anorexia, some of these things can also have a lack of good gut bacteria. About alcoholism. I used to be a heavy drinker. I used to drink myself to sleep at night. I was addicted to tobacco, and I don't do any of those things anymore. I feel so much better without it, actually. But let's look at the research. This is alcoholism and lacking gut bacteria. A study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences did a study, and they found an imbalance of gut bacteria in certain alcoholics. What did they find? They had 60 alcoholics. Now, if you were to just guess, before we actually see what the study concludes, do you think the alcoholics that had more bacteria or less bacteria did better? What would be your guess? More. That's a very good guess. What did they end up finding? 24 of them had lower levels of bacteria in their guts, and after 19 days alcohol-free, those with lower levels of bacteria had higher levels of anxious feeling, depression, and desire for alcohol. So you're exactly right. And the 36 participants with better gut flora or better gut bacteria were doing better. And so could it be that even things like addiction may be in part because of bacteria or lack of bacteria within the gut? And I was sharing with a friend of ours who had struggled for years with methamphetamine, which is probably one of the worst drugs that humans could take. It's like meth and heroin. These are absolutely destructive drugs. And he said to me, as I was sharing with him both the research and the scripture and these kind of things, he said, all addicts have one thing in common. And I'm wondering, what is it? And he said, all addicts have a terrible diet. And I thought, wow, that's true. Because when I was struggling with addiction, I had a horrible diet. Like I said, it was just junk food. It was basically meat and junk food. That was all I ate. Refined food, junk food, pop, just sugar, these kind of things. And this was my lifestyle. And my body felt horrible as a young person. I feel better now in my 40s than I did when I was a teenager because of the change of lifestyle. I was trying to feed my body, and I had no idea that there was a connection between what I was eating and the way that I felt and my emotions. I had no idea. And so this literally changed my life as my diet was changed. And so, okay, looking at this, could it be that there's a dietary impact impacting the bacteria? Having a lack of bacteria may be making you more prone to being depressed, anxious, and then because you're anxious and depressed, you feel like you have to cover it up with something. Drugs, alcohol, tobacco, illicit relationships, what have you, something. So they've done research and they're finding that fruits and vegetables may help to combat drug addiction. Fascinating. Very fascinating. So, and I actually do seminars teaching people how to overcome addiction. And dietary change is one of, it's not the only, there's other things. Obviously, there's emotional things to deal with. But what's fascinating is what we're looking at tonight can actually help lower, if you're living a lifestyle, like you're getting exercise, you're getting sunlight, you're eating a good diet, there's some other things to do. What happens is your body begins to function the way it was designed to. These things together. What happens is your stress and anxiety begins to lower. As your stress and anxiety begins to lower, you feel less like going after the drugs, and stressful situations are not as stressful when your body is functioning properly. And one of the things I love is to see people both healed, reversing things like diabetes, arthritis, depression, and also overcoming addictions, seeing lives changed. And so notice here. It says, in our medical institutions, clear instructions should be given in regard to temperance. The patient should be shown the evil of intoxicating liquor and the blessing of total abstinence. They should be asked to discard the things that have ruined their health, and the place of these things should be supplied with an abundance of fruit. Oranges, lemons, prunes, peaches, and many other varieties can be obtained, for the Lord's world painstaking effort is put forth. So very fascinating. And from Australia, from the University of Queensland, the title of, speaking of this study, is Fruit is a Depression Buster for Women. Now, what does that mean? It means that women who are eating more fruit have lower levels of depression. Well, that's good news. And this is a review. This is from the Journal of Neuropsychiatry of Clinical Neuroscience. And this is the title of this entry is Depression and Fruit Treatment. I know it's very small. I probably should have blown it up, but I'll just read it to you here. Up here it says, depression is a common mood disorder affecting sleep, appetite, and libido, and it's also one of the manifestations of dementia and may lead to suicide attempts, particularly with violent methods. Research has shown the involvement of serotonin, melatonin, and tryptophan in depression. These are these neurotransmitters, some of the neurotransmitters. And and then it says, research has shown the involvement of serotonin, melatonin, and tryptophan in depression. And then it goes on to say up here, there are some high content sources of serotonin, melatonin, and tryptophan, which can provide the body with these substances. Well, what are they? These include plantains, pineapples, bananas, kiwis, plums, and tomatoes for serotonin. And so then it goes on to talk about this. And basically what they're doing is they're looking at these foods. And how many of you like fruit? Anybody like fruit here? Yeah, me too. I love fruit. I mean, actually, I was eating some on the way here. I've been walking a lot. I walked maybe, probably 7.5, 8 miles today, and I'll just keep getting skinnier and skinnier if I don't eat some food. And so I ate I ate a banana, I had some dates on the way here, and that was I normally just two meals a day, but when I exercise too much, I have to add a little bit more. But nevertheless, the point being, one of the best things you can do is you're eating the plant foods. As you're eating these, you're giving these neurotransmitters, you're giving them to your body, you're giving the fiber. I mean, you know it all. I've said it 100 times. I don't need to beat a dead horse, but you get the idea. And they conclude by saying, it seems that using such foods in the daily diet of depressed patients not only could treat the disease, but may improve the prognosis of dementia and decrease violent suicide attempts. Do you think Americans are getting further and further away on average? I'm not saying everybody. We're all different. Everybody's an individual. But do you think as a society in general, people are getting further and further away from a natural diet that humans used to eat? I mean, you think about your grandparents or great-grandparents. I mean, they had never had, like, Cheetos, right? They didn't even know what Cheetos were. They didn't exist back in day, right? They didn't have all of these chips and these, bright blue-colored candies, and these things didn't even exist in their day. They had a garden. They grew a bunch of their veggies. They, maybe had some meat here and there, but that was life. It was simple food. And now almost everything's refined. You got sugar, sugar, sugar. You got chemicals in the food. You have all these things. And people are becoming significantly more depressed. That's not the only factor. There's various factors. But that is, I believe, one of the clear factors. Well, they've done some research. This is from the British Journal of Health Psychology. The title of this study that they came up with is "Many Apples a Day Keep the Blues Away." Now, you might be thinking, many apples? I got to eat many apples every day? No, you don't have to eat many apples every day. They were play on the old saying, an apple a day, what? Keeps the doctor away. So they're saying, well, many apples a day keeps the blues away. But it wasn't simply apples. It was a diversity of fruits or vegetables. This is 2 studies. What they found is that for every serving of fruit or vegetable you ate in a day, it would actually statistically increase your levels of happiness. But then they discovered something fascinating about it, that it would actually increase your happiness the next day. So what you ate today, how many fruits and vegetables you ate today, would forecast how happy you would be tomorrow. So it seemed to be clearly a causative factor. And then it was replicated. So this is the British Journal of Health Psychology, but then the American Journal of Public Health, they replicated this study, and this is what they found. They found that if you ate 0 servings, this is life satisfaction or change in happiness. This is how many servings of fruits or vegetables in a day. If you ate 0, you were at your statistically lowest level of happiness. And if you ate 1, it didn't make much of a difference. But you could see as you continued to add more fruits and vegetables daily to your diet, up to 8 servings, they found a statistically significant increase in levels of happiness. So you actually get to choose how happy you are. Now, I want to say this. If you haven't had any fruits or vegetables today, don't go home tonight and eat 8 servings of fruits or vegetables before bed. You're going to feel terrible. You're not going to sleep well with a belly full of food. So don't go home and late at night and eat all that. But you can begin that process of starting to eat more. Tomorrow that would be the best thing to do, right? So they've actually done some research on trying to figure out some of the best microbial diversity. We can't say this is the absolute best because they studied so much, but what did they find? The University of California, San Diego reports on the largest human study on the microbiome. It turns out that people who consume more than 30 different plants per week have the greatest diversity of bacteria in their guts, well, at least compared with those who ate less than 10 different plants a week. You might be thinking, 30 plants a week? That's impossible. Well, it's not as hard as you. And the reason I know this, because I've known this for years now, and then I pay attention to what I eat. So I don't all the time, but I have in the past to try to figure, well, do I eat 30? And I actually probably often do exactly that, or sometimes much more. An example. Sometimes if you go to some of the grocery stores, and they'll have those plastic containers of salad mix. And some of those salad mixes, you read on the top, some of them may just be spinach, or some of them just may be lettuce or romaine or whatever. But some of them have a diversity of things in there. And some of them are called like spring mix or what have you. And I've counted, one of them we were eating, my wife and I, it had 13 or 14 different kind of greens in one box. So you're almost halfway through the week of getting your 30 servings from, and by the way, who just eats greens? You probably throw in some carrots and some, whatever else in there, tomatoes or whatever. So from that one, you may have, and then I'm not just eating that for a meal, I'm eating, rice and beans or what have you. So you see how, and I don't actually suggest getting 30 at one time or even 15 at a meal. That's not my point that you need to do that. But the point is, it's not as hard as it may sound. And you actually, it's not really easy to digest 20 different things at one meal. It's actually best to have a few things at one meal and then a few things at the next, but diversify over the course of your several meals. That's actually much easier on your digestion. But getting that diversity can be very important. Well, there's a term that is used that it's not common in our modern vernacular. The doctors may be more acquainted with this, but it's a term called dyspepsia. And dyspepsia has to do with having indigestion or consequent irritability. So looking at this, here we read, for a dyspeptic stomach, you may place upon your tables fruits of different kinds, but not too many different ones at one meal. Remember, diversity is good, but you don't want a massive diversity at every meal. You just want to change them up over the course of each meal. And so it would also be well for us to do less cooking and to eat more fruit in its natural state. Let us eat freely of grapes, apples, peaches, oranges, blackberries, and all other kinds of fruit which can be obtained. Now, why do I share all of this information? I had mentioned that I had had 11 years of depression. And what had happened is I was living overseas with my wife. Actually, we were working together. We were working with a group of young people, and it was before we were married, and we all ended up getting stomach trouble. And we had stomach trouble for years. I mean, years, but I never correlated the stomach trouble with the depression. I just, I didn't even think about it, but it was correlated. And so then I had stomach trouble for years. I had depression for years. Some of the time it maybe was more like cyclical, like seasonal depression, worse in the winter, better in the summer, and so forth. And then after probably somewhere around 8 years of it, we were looking for land, to buy some land, to get a property, and we ended up getting ticks and so forth. And I had a doctor friend who said, hey, since you've been bit by a tick, why don't you take some antibiotics, and that will help hopefully cause it so that you do not have Lyme disease. And so, okay, I'll take the antibiotics. And what did we find yesterday that antibiotics can do? Can increase rates of depression, right? And it was at that point that I just went into hardcore, full-time, year-round depression after taking that. So we had kind of cyclical, and then it was just, and then the next year got bit by a tick, took it again, and it just continued. And this somewhere, like I said, 10, 11 years or so. And then I saw basically something similar to this next quote that I'm going to show you, talking about eating these simple foods and fruits and veggies and so forth. And I thought, wow, really? I'll give it a try. And so I did it. And within 2 weeks, my depression went away. I thought, wow, this is incredible. Why did this happen? And then, like I said, I had asthma, allergies, the depression, I had migraines, and all of these things went away. My body started functioning better. I felt like running all the time. Meaning if I had to go get something from the car, instead of just walking to the car, I'd run to the car. And then when I was done getting whatever I needed in the car, I'd run back to the house. I had so much energy. I'd never felt this before. Not even, maybe as a little kid, but I couldn't even remember ever feeling so good. And it was something similar, basically this. It says, in many cases of sickness, the very best remedy is for the patient to fast for a meal or two, just one time. So if you've had maybe gut trouble, you fast for a meal or two. If you're a type 1 diabetic, you don't want to do this, but your average healthy person, you skip a meal or two, and then what ends up happening, it says, overworked organs of digestion may have an opportunity to rest. Then what? A fruit diet for a few days has often brought great relief to brain workers. Many times a short period of entire abstinence from food, followed by simple, moderate eating, has led to recovery through nature's own recuperative effort. An abstemious or a simple diet for a month or two would convince many sufferers that the path of self-denial is the path to health. And so trying this, now this says to go on a few days of a fruit diet. I didn't know how long. I tried it for 2 weeks and my depression went away. I'm not saying everybody needs to go on a fruit diet for 2 weeks, but I did that and it was actually amazing. I felt so good. I thought, man, this is incredible. Then I began to add veggies and the nuts and the grains and everything back, but because it said to go on a simple diet after that for a month or two, and it literally changed my life. It's one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And so to kind of encapsulate what we just saw here, it said, just to review, number one, fasting for a meal or two. Just let the organs of digestion take an opportunity to rest. My gut had trouble for years, and so giving it a break altogether, the body can begin to heal. We talked about leaky gut. The junctions of the intestines can open up, and so as we do that, what ends up happening, as you fast, the gut can actually begin to heal and help people out. It actually can make it easier to heal. And so taking that fast, taking a little break can be a benefit there. Number 2, eating more whole fruits. You could go on a very temporary fruit diet. I don't suggest, I'm not telling you to do something, but just a short time. You don't have to, but if you want to, it can be very healing to the intestines. And some people say, well, watch out, what about diabetes? Here's the actual research from the British Medical Journal, one of the most prestigious journals out there, looking at fruit, its chances of increasing or decreasing the chances of you having type 2 diabetes. So what they found is that the reference range is the black line, and so cantaloupe, the melons are one of the things that for people can actually spike, and about 50% of people can spike blood sugar. But then once you get on to things like strawberries, for most people, they lower your chances. And then you come to oranges, they lower your chances of type 2 diabetes more. Peaches, plums, and apricots. Notice the plums are here. They lower your chances more. Grapefruit lowers it more. Bananas more. Apples and pears more. Prunes. Now we notice a prune is a dried plum, right? And a prune, you would think, people say be careful with the dried fruit. Dried fruit is a concentrated food. Be careful, that's going to cause blood sugar issues. It's just the opposite, actually. Actually, a lot of dried fruit is actually even more beneficial sometimes. They've done research. I could actually go into it. I have a whole video. We have a YouTube channel called Health and Homestead, where we reach millions of people. So long story short, I go through the research on dried fruit. It's contrary to what most people think. The actual studies are different than what people intuitively think about it. Actually, very healthy in general, but specifically, if you're going to eat dried fruit, I only eat dried fruit that does not have preservatives in it. Because remember, preservatives are trying to keep things from breaking down. Well, when you dehydrate things, they naturally don't break down at that point, but as you chew them, they do begin to break down. But if they're filled with preservatives, you can actually get stomach trouble from the preservatives in the dried fruit. So we just buy things that don't have, I think it's sorbate or, various, sulfur. Sulfur's the other one. That's the word. What's that? Sulfur dioxide. Yeah, exactly.
Apricots, you can hardly find it without it.
Yes, one of the only places that I typically find it is Costco, but there's not a Costco right in the area here. But if you ever go into Little Rock, they do have Costco there. I don't know if they have it here, and it's hit or miss whether they have the apricots. But I actually think they taste better when they're actually in their natural form rather than when they add that sulfur dioxide in there. They're not even as good. Sure, they look bright colored, but yeah, it's just not as good. So then, grapes and raisins are beneficial when it comes to lowering rates of type 2 diabetes. I mean, they just kind of phenomenal. Blueberries are just an amazing fruit, obviously. And so, looking at this, so what are ways to help your gut? We talked about fasting, eating more whole fruits for a few days. I mean, not just for a few days, but you could go on a fruit diet if you want for a few days, and then begin to eat more whole grains. That could be whole wheat bread, oatmeal, or other whole, well-cooked grains. But like I said, if you're one of the roughly 6% of people who struggles with wheat or gluten, just avoid it. The good news is there's other whole grains that you can eat. You can have amaranth or buckwheat, or you can have oatmeal. But oatmeal, if you're very sensitive, you have to buy an oatmeal that's gluten-free, because sometimes there's just a very small amount in there mixed in accidentally. So you have to be careful if you're one of the people that's very sensitive to it. We'll leave it at that. But also eat more whole vegetables. And I say whole, they don't have to all be raw. Just non-refined is what we're talking about. We're talking about not the sugar from the beet, but eat the beet. You get the idea. And so, but it is good often. Now, if you have serious gut issues, we have a whole seminar where we go deeper into the gut-brain connection, but this will go contrary to what many people think, but if you have serious intestinal issues like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, one of the things you could do is temporarily, if you're trying to balance your gut again, eat everything cooked, actually. Many people think, no, it's easier to eat it raw. It's actually not with people who have things like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's. Initially, going on a cooked diet, even the fruit cooking it for those people, can actually make it easier to digest. And hopefully over time, as their intestines, the lining begins to heal, that they can begin to also take some raw fruit and veggies and so forth. But I would switch, so go from the cooked if you're in those very, I'm not saying this for everybody, this is a very small sect of people, but if you're in those groups, go on the cooked food for a short time, see if it heals, then slowly add back the raw fruit, and then if that's okay with you, and you want to avoid things with seeds in them, that's often hard for people with ulcerative colitis. I'm getting off the point. And if you struggle with any of these things, like you have serious intestinal issues, also avoid spicy food. That is something, spices can actually open the junctions of the intestines, and it can cause, it can actually cause a gut-brain connection of anxiety and stress. Even one spicy meal a week for those who are prone to it can make them more prone to anxiety and even depression. Fascinating reason. I could have a bunch of research that I go into, but not for spicy food, but I found that I'm much happier without it. I love the flavor of it, but my intestines do so much better. My mental health is so much better. My wife and I, we actually have a better marriage after we got rid of spicy food. We're much kinder and patient with each other. It literally has changed our marriage. So no pressure on anybody else. You get to make your own decisions. But I just want to share with you, since we're talking about the gut-brain connection, and also eating about a handful of nuts a day. You really don't need any more than a handful of nuts. You'll get all the cognitive benefit in a handful of them, and you don't really need any more. Now, if you're getting really, really skinny, you can eat more than a handful a day, but in general, you don't need more than a handful a day. And so another thing, if you're really actually going plant-based, it'd be wise to take some vitamin B12, but actually, it is instructed that everybody, regardless of their dietary intake, over the age of about 50 or 55, should be taking a B12 supplement, because as we get older, our intestines struggle more and more to be able to uptake the B12. So as we get older, that can be, I'm not a big promoter of supplements in general, but this is one of the few that, especially as you're getting older, or if you're on a plant-based diet, it can be wise. You can actually get it from certain plants, like something called duckweed, and it's, once again, actually animals and plants do not produce B12. It actually comes from the bacteria. And so, but it is in animals because of bacteria. And so it is also in certain plants, like duckweed, that is in water and creates a bacterial environment. That also makes it, that's all beside the point. It can be beneficial to get your B12. And two more things. This is such a fascinating study. I've met the family of the man who started this prison. Some people detest the idea of private prisons, but you'll see why I actually have a little different opinion. It's because of the Victor Valley Medium Community Correctional Facility in Adelanto, California. I think this is the longest name for a prison they could possibly have thought of. And what they did is, it was started by a Christian man who happened to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And he wanted to start a prison that was a true correctional facility. Because you may know me, you may not know, but do people generally get corrected after going to jail? No, they typically come out almost worse on the other side. They actually have learned better how to be a criminal after going there. And so this guy, he decided, his name is Terry Moreland, and what he decided to do to start a prison and to help change the lifestyle of the people in there. And so he got a contract with the CDC, but not the one you're thinking of, not Centers for. He got a contract with the California Department of Corrections for a prison with 500 inmates, and they actually split it physically into two sides. One side would go on a standard prison diet, and the other side would have a plant-based diet with all these fruits and veggies and whole grains and nuts and seeds. I mean, basically a really healthy diet. But this is what they did. They allowed them to choose between a New Start program of a plant-based diet, occupational training, Bible studies, and anger management classes. Now, virtually every prison there is has the opportunity for Bible studies in the United States, but that is, in my estimation, an important factor. But people shouldn't be forced to do anything. I believe in freedom of choice. But nevertheless, even at this allowed them to choose. So one of the government officials, when they heard that they were going to do this, they said, no way, no way. These men would rather burn the place to the ground than go on a plant-based diet. And so they said, well, we'll give them the choice. And so they gave the people the choice. And what percent of men, these, gangbangers and so forth, chose of their own volition to go on a plant-based diet? Well, it turns out it was surprisingly 85% of them chose to go on a vegan diet. That's what they chose to do. Now, at that time in the state of California, there's something called recidivism. It's a statistical measure. Basically, after you go to prison once, when you get out, you're a number in the system. And you're watched for the rest of your life. Do you ever go back to prison? If you go back to prison, you're part of the recidivism issue. And at that time in the state of California, they had a recidivism problem of 95%, meaning 95% of people, after they got out of prison, commit another crime and went back to prison. That is an unbelievable number. That is an unbelievable number. Well, what ended up happening, while running this prison, the recidivism rate from these people dropped the normal rate from California, 95%, all the way down to 2%. Now, the average in America is just over 50%, but this dropped all the way down to 2%. I actually interviewed one of the people that helped start this, and his name was Richard Bland. Richard Bland was a man who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. Picture himself. He's like, here's Martin Luther King Jr., that's me right behind him. He said, I'm the only person alive in this picture. And part of it was, well, number one, he wasn't murdered, and number two, he's in his 80s probably now, he eats a very healthy diet. So this man eats a very healthy diet. He was a part of helping start this place, and he was one who also told about this, and I've also read an article on it. And what ended up happening was, well, this is incredible. So people began to find out in California about this amazing experiment at the Victor Valley Medium Community Correctional Facility in Adelanto. And so other prisoners were asking to be transferred into this prison. And so they had a wait list to get on the plant-based side because people were like, hey, man, because not only were they being but their families' lives were being changed. Well, so this began to create a buzz, it began to create a stir, and so you know what they ended up doing? They shut this prison down. They took away the contract from this man, and it began to tank again, just like normal prisons do. And from what I understand, the reason is because prisons, sadly, evidently, are big business. And if in business, the best thing to have in business is to have repeat customers, right? To have repeat customers. And so you couldn't have this happening. And so what they did was they said, well, the guy who was running it, he was taking money from collect calls, the guys who was running it. Now, do you know what he was doing with the money that he made? So he was running this prison cheaper than the government prisons were running for. He was running it cheaper. And you know what he was doing with the money? He was using it to help people get houses when they got out of prison. So he wasn't like, he didn't need the money. He was literally doing this as a humanitarian effort to try to help people out. It didn't matter. And so to him, the money was not even an issue. He simply wanted to help people out. And so even if there was money coming in for collect calls, which is just, it's a loophole. So, you can get somebody in trouble for anything. There's an old idea that show me the man and I'll show you the crime. You can find a crime, they say, everybody commits 3 crimes a day. And that's probably not totally true, but the point is, if they want to find something, they found it and they shut the place down. But thinking about this is not the only prison that's changed diets and actually seen recidivism rates change. There's been at least one other one. I think one other one, if I remember correctly, was in the state of Ohio. There's a woman who helped do that there. There's also a prison in Southern California called the Blythe Prison. And they also changed the diet of theirs. And what they did was, it was really cool what they did. The lifers, the guys who were never going to get out of prison. They had no chance of ever getting out. And they trained them in teaching health. So these guys, then every new person who came in, have a lifer teach you about good nutrition. So these guys who had no purpose in life, they were literally just waiting in the cell, going out and working out and nothing to look forward to in life. Now they actually had a purpose. And these guys were teaching the other prisoners about healthy food and a healthy diet. Well, I think it was like a 3,000 people prison there, or 3,000 inmates. And they began to demand better food, and they wanted healthy, nutritious food. And so that prison ended up, I'm guessing it was at a separate time from this one, but it ended up being the prison, Blythe prison, began to be the prison with the lowest levels of hepatitis C. There was less sexually transmitted disease going on in the hospital because their mental health was better. They weren't doing all kinds of crazy stuff anymore. It was changing their ideas. Interesting, there was a book called Ministry of Healing, and it said this: wrong habits of eating and the use of unhealthful food are in no small degree responsible for the intemperance and crime and wretchedness that curse the world. And I actually think this is true, seeing the research that we just saw. Sure enough, that this is one of the issues, and I know from my own experience, I used to be one of the most angry human beings I've ever seen. But after the dietary change, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel, because I had quit doing drugs, I had quit smoking, I had quit drinking, but I still felt like an absolute addict, even if I wasn't doing it anymore. But after the dietary change, I thought, wow, this must be what it feels like to be a normal human being. I didn't even know what that could feel like, but I began to think, oh, this must be what it feel like this. And so it has been totally life-changing for me. I want to close tonight talking about the oldest scientific study in recorded history. Medical historians have looked through the records to find what is the oldest scientific study in all of recorded history. And we read in Perspectives of Clinical Research, 2010, the evolution of clinical research, meaning looking at the history of clinical research, a history before and beyond by James Lynn. And this is what they say in the article. It says in 562 BC, so 2,500 plus years ago, the world's first clinical trial is recorded in the book of Daniel in the Bible. Now that's quite fascinating, that the oldest scientific study in all of recorded history that they have been able to find, they tell us, is found in the Bible. And the thing that I find so fascinating about this is, number one, okay, it comes. I've studied the book of Daniel quite a bit. And actually, I'm going to be putting on a seminar on Bible prophecy, obviously, after this. But Daniel chapter 1 is specifically where the prophecy. And what is it about? Just to break it down. And this fits exactly with what we've been talking about. One is a story of Daniel being taken captive from Jerusalem, his hometown. Obviously, Jerusalem, Israel right now is in the news big time, obviously, with the war taking place right now. But 2,500 years ago, Daniel was taken from Jerusalem. There was a war there, and he was taken captive and brought back to Babylon. Obviously, people have just been taken captive and taken away to another city right now. I didn't even think about that until I'm talking about it right now. But in the story, this is what happened. And so there Daniel's taken back. Now, he was evidently a part of a family that was well-educated, because that's what they took. They took the captives of the educated specifically. They bring him back to Babylon. Daniel was put along with at least 3 of his friends. There were probably more, but we're only told the names of 4 of them. So Daniel, someone named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The king, the Babylonian, or they gave them names, pagan names, which were, anybody know? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They gave them those names, kind of the names of some of their gods. But nevertheless, so Daniel has 3 friends. They're there, and they're taken back, and they're put through a 3-year educational system, kind of like a university experience, to make them what they called at the time wise men, kind of like counselors to the king, the cabinet. They went through the schooling. Well, Daniel and his friends, they believed in the Torah. They believed in the Scriptures, the Old Testament portion that they had at the time. And the Torah talked about certain foods they shouldn't eat, certain foods were fine to eat. And so here they were, and there's all this food out there, and they didn't know, like, is this one we can eat, this one we can't eat? It would be kind of hard to tell at times maybe. And so they actually said, well, what the Bible says, Daniel 1 verse 8, it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So Daniel decided, hey, I'm not going to do that. I can't do this. So he came up with an idea, and this is the first scientific study in recorded history, according to medical historians. What was the study? It was in verse 12 where it says, test your servants. Here's the scientific test. Test your servants for 10 days and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Now in the Hebrew language, the pulse there are things that are grown from seeds. So Daniel and his friends choose, because they didn't know what they could eat maybe in that situation, they're like, hey, we'll just go on a plant-based diet. Well, what ended up happening? He said, well, let's just do a test. Let's just see what happens. Because the guy's thinking like, no, you're going to get unhealthy. Daniel's like, let's just give it a try. Let's test it out. And what was the conclusion at the end of this time? It says in verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found Daniel and his friends 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. So it actually tells us that Daniel and his friends, when they went on this diet, feeding all the bacteria, the microbiome, giving them the plants that are made for our neurotransmitters, that what they ate actually enhanced their cognition. And what's fascinating about this is that the first study in all of recorded history is a study on the gut-brain connection. Fascinating. Now I'm going to show you a video clip from a documentary a number of years ago called Ancient Health. We've already watched a couple clips, or one or two clips anyway, and so this is another clip from the film that we made.
But the main thing that folks should be concerned about is how long you live and how likely you are to get disease. And there have been 3 major studies published on this subject, big meta-analyses. And these meta-analyses, and only 3 big ones have been published, they show consistently that low-carb diets, in other words, low plant food diets, high animal food diets, consistently they show that they're associated with more heart disease and more death, more mortality.
If you look around the world and you look at these people in the blue zones, the average percentage of calories from carbs ranges from about 50% to about 80%. Carbs are not the enemy, refined carbs are the enemy.
There have been a number of recent studies. Dr. Beeshold out of Phoenix, Arizona, first she did an observational study showing that plant-based diet actually significantly improves your depression and anxiety stress score. It's called a DASS score.
So the mood actually is improved when you get the right amount of carbohydrates, but also the right type of carbohydrates and less protein.
Then she followed up with an interventional study, and that's where she took people who are not on a plant-based diet and put them on a plant-based diet for 2 weeks. She also put them on a plant-based diet plus fish for 2 weeks to see which one would be superior. And it turned out the fish diet wasn't any more superior than the carnivore diet. But the plant-based diet, significant, dramatic changes, statistically significant changes in just 2 weeks in their mental ability.
We see when people go on this diet and drink plenty of water, get plenty of rest, follow these natural remedies, that it's just like something snaps in their brain, and it doesn't take like weeks or months.
Plant-based diet is key in our program for depression and anxiety recovery. The results are outstanding because it's a comprehensive approach. It's not just diet. We also utilize exercise, and we're utilizing correct thoughts and a lot of different modalities. But the diet is a key element.
I went on a plant-based diet about 5 weeks ago.
It's amazing because even if they had not told me he had the diet change, the first thing I noticed was he was bringing his schoolwork in.
And my teacher has actually been bragging on how much better I've been behaving since I've been on the diet.
In class, he wasn't getting as distracted, that he was paying attention, he was able to listen more closely, he was being alert, his discernment was better. He was more diligent, everything.
I can pay attention more. My mind is more clear since I've been on the diet.
It's just a huge improvement. And I also noticed he lost a lot of weight. But the main things I noticed was behavioral.
A study in a middle school has showed clearly that switching the menu from animal source to plant source diet almost eliminated absenteeism, increased and enhanced attention and homework performance and performance at school. It almost eliminated acts of violence as well as teen pregnancies.
And so they just feel better. Everywhere the blood flows, everywhere that perfect circulation goes, they feel better. Not just in body, but in mind. Clears up their thoughts even.
And every single day since I've been on a plant-based diet, the clarity continues to increase and my face continues to look younger, and my body feels like I look more vibrant. I've looked at pictures of myself before and after, and I look 5 years older, even just 10 months ago, than I do now.
What we eat does get turned into neurotransmitters. It actually helps us or hurts us, depending on what we're eating in regards to our brain chemistry. And it plays a vital role in health of the brain.
They'll say within 3 or 4 days, they seem to have clarity. They're alert. They listen in class better. They absorb more, and they do better on their tests.
The fog has been lifted out of my head. I think clearer. I've got better ideas, I believe. I can put 2 and 2 together faster, and just in general, I'm happier.
In fact, diet alone, studies show that diet alone will reduce your depression and anxiety scores by half just by dramatically changing your diet to a plant-based. And so that's significant. Now, we go for more than just half, and so that's why we have a whole program that includes more than this. But just the diet alone will make a big difference.
You don't have to choose between high quality living and longevity. It's the same program. The same New Start approach to living helps you live longer, and it helps you live better.
It's fascinating when they repeat the thing and try it today, they find that it also has cognitive benefit. Just like, and that's part true science. True science, too many works one time, they tried another, other scientists tried it, doesn't work. Not only caused a benefit, we see that in the Bible, it says that it impacted them, and it's actually impacting students even today. It changed my life. It literally changed my life. The clarity of mind, happiness on so many levels. And Daniel and his friends did this, but then Daniel, that's in Daniel chapter 1, but that prepared Daniel for Daniel chapter 2. And we're going to actually be looking this coming week, actually starting tomorrow and then through next week and onward after that, we're going to be looking at Bible prophecy, and this is the foundation of it. Daniel chapter 1 is actually the foundation. What is taking place in our world right now is we're actually seeing things begin to take place that the Bible talked about. Actually, we've seen for years, but we're seeing clearly things happening. And we're going to be looking in the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking in the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at, tomorrow night, we're going to be looking at, same time, same place, archaeology, prophecy in our day, foundation. That will be tomorrow. Then we skip Sunday. We'll be back for Monday. We'll be looking at Revelation's answer to the war behind the wars. What is happening? We're going to look at that Monday. Then we'll be back Tuesday for when Christianity follows the beast. What does the Bible talk about this? We're going to look at this. And then Thursday, we skip Wednesday. We're back Thursday for the most amazing prophecy. We'll be back for that. Then after that, we have Friday, the Antichrist Revealed Part 1. This is something we're going to look at. You think, like, what are these strange beasts and animals? These are just symbols. The Bible even tells us they're symbols. But it makes it so clear. I will not tell you who it is. You're going to tell me. It is absolutely crystal clear. When we look at what it says, we're living in incredible times. And so I want to invite you back to that. But it all begins with Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1 began to prepare Daniel for Daniel chapter 2. And this is a microcosm of what will take place, well, in the future. But So I want to invite you out, and before we go, you don't want to miss. It is some powerful information. It's really life-changing. But before we close, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. I thank you for what you've done in my life. I actually thank you for the 11 years of depression. I'm thankful that life is so much better on the other side, and that you've taught me how to live in such a way that I can walk with joy and peace and contentment and look forward to the day each day and go to bed with a clear conscience and feel good. And Lord, that you've given us these things, and actually the foundations of it actually all were given back in the Bible. And Lord, as we recognize that we're living in some incredible times, I pray as we look into these studies, both through prophecy, history, archaeology, and looking at the present tense, what's happening, and the soon-to-be future, I pray that you would bless us in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, thank you for coming. I will be outside. If you have any questions, I would love to talk.